Today, we'll be discussing climate change. Like we all know, climate change is one of the biggest challenges affecting the world right now. And African countries are particularly affected by climate change because we don't have the capacity, or we have limited capacity to cope with such level of emergencies and environmental disasters that is arising from climate change. And that is why we've brought together experts from different countries in Africa today to discuss how African countries can benefit from the outcome of COP28. For the UNFCCC Conference of Party meetings every year. The last one was held in Dubai in November last year. And this Conference of Party meetings, amongst other things, is to discuss issues on how every country can pay their fair share of African countries too have been involved in negotiations over the years. Last year, we had negotiations around loss and damage. There was a day for health. But the biggest challenge is that over the years, we've seen the African countries have not been able to maximize the climate change related negotiations over the world. There is a whole lot of funding that the global north is releasing. But one of the biggest challenges we're having in Africa is that we've not been able to maximize this funding to leverage or to build resilience to climate change in our countries, both government and non-governmental organizations. And that is why global emerging pathogens treatment best experts on the subject matter to discuss how African countries, both at the government level and non-governmental organizations, can leverage and maximize the benefits of the outcomes of COP28. And today we have experts from all over the continent. We have the director, we have my very good friend, Dr. Itwa, we have Dr. Linda Gallo, and other experts that will be speaking to us on the subject matter today. I use this opportunity to thank our speakers for agreeing to share their expertise and their knowledge on the subject matter, and also thank our participants for creating time to attend this webinar again today. Without our speakers and the audience and participants, this webinar will not have a meaning. So we thank you very much for attending this webinar, and we sincerely hope that by the end of this webinar, we all have a clear understanding of how we can maximize the outcomes of COP28 and other benefits that we'll get from climate change as African countries, both at the government level and also non-governmental organizations. Without wasting our time, let me introduce GET for those that are joining us for the first time. My name is Dr. Dotun Babadoye. I'm the Chief Operating Officer of Global Emerging Pathogens Treatment Consortium, GET. GET is an organization that was set up 10 years ago. GET is celebrating its 10th anniversary this year at the peak of the Ebola crisis that ravaged countries in West Africa. It was clear then that West African countries lack the capacity to cope with such level of biosecurity threats and health emergency. And there was a need to set up organizations that can build capacity of both government and non-governmental organizations to cope with such level of extreme emergency. And experts from different countries in Africa came together and formed an organization called GET. Over the years, we've grown to become one of the biggest think tanks in Africa in the area of biosecurity and One Health, and we work in the One Health space, linking human health, animal health, and our shared environment. GET is, the headquarters of GET is in Nigeria, and we're legally registered in Ghana, in Sierra Leone, and the United States of America. Once again, thank you to our speakers and our participants for attending this meeting. Without wasting our time, I will hand over to my very, very wonderful friend, the moderator of today, Dr. Eugene Itwa. Doc, you have the floor, please.
Thank you very much, everyone. It's good to have you here, our distinguished audience. From the count, we have no less than 58 locations, and those locations could have more than one individual listening to this program or being part of this program. So we want to thank you for being part of it. And my name is Dr. Eugene Itua. I'm the CEO of Natural Eco Capital. Natural Eco Capital is a sustainability consulting firm that support both the public and the private sector organizations. And one of the things we did before we closed out for the year was to support in training at least about 55 persons, staff of or associate of the Global Center on Adaptation. Earlier at COP28, working with the National Council on Climate Change, and indeed the federal government, record that Nigeria launched its long-term low emission development strategy. The development of that strategy was led by Natural Eco Capital. And earlier in 2021, the initial step was submitted to UNFCCC, and that was the Long-Term Vision 2050. So those are some of the things we've done, and there are other things that we're doing as well. You recall that a number of us that were there at COP28, whether as a party involved in the negotiation or part of the party overflow or CSOs, stakeholders generally that were there, we all were involved in one aspect or the other to make that program come out successfully the way the COP came out. Well, take note that there was a summary document of the entire outcome, talking about the global climate action of COP28. That document provides an overview of the critical outcomes. You can access it anywhere. Just search, you will see it. I came out with about 4 pillars that had been established by COP28 presidency. One of it is tracking a just, orderly, and equitable energy transition, facing climate finance, and then focusing on people's lives and livelihood. One other thing was the other thing that in terms of inclusivity, it needs to be total. Just to say that the summary document is not exhaustive, as over 170 announcements were made, ranging from pledges to declarations, even publications and reports with new initiatives and progress updates. Again, you can search for this and see what that summary document holds from all the discussion that to further throw more insight into all that had happened, what are the lessons, what can we benefit from it, how do we accelerate actions, just name it. We have distinguished panelists that will be speaking to us on these very issues that we're talking about. Ladies and gentlemen, and indeed our distinguished audience, I will introduce them one after the other as they come on to speak. The first person I'm going to introduce is this. He has over 38 years of expertise in environmental management and sustainable development. And you can understand 38 years of experience, what is embedded in all of that. And interestingly, one of the things that he had done is to initiate a crucial memorandum of understanding with a national sovereign investment authority to enhance climate change agenda in his country. Today, he leads the National Council on Climate Change for Nigeria. He is Dr. Salisu Dahiru. He will be speaking to us on this topic that says implementing effective policies to maximize the outcomes of COP28 by African countries. Just to say, recall I had talked about the long-term low emission development strategy. He is the one leading the country in its implementation and, of course, the development of that instrument. Our DG, Dr. Salisu Dahiru, we are all waiting to hear you speak on the maximize the outcomes of COP28 by Africa countries. Meanwhile, before he comes up, it will really and then put our questions in the chat box to our distinguished speakers for the day. National Council on Climate Change, Nigeria. Please. You have the microphone, as they will say. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, sir. I'm okay with Chukwemeka. I'll be replacing, I'll be speaking on behalf of my DG. But sorry, we have a technical hitch. Can you please retake the question so I can pick it from there, please, sir?
Yeah, it's just speak generally on how we can implement effective policies that support us in maximizing the outcome of COP28 by Africa countries. Perhaps if you want to give it using the lens of Nigeria as a country, all well and good. So you know the dimension you want to take it from. How we can implement an effective policy to maximize the outcome of COP28. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Doctor. On behalf of my DG, I'm very happy to participate in this program. We all know that Nigeria joined the rest of the world and effectively participated on the just concluded COP28 that was held in Dubai, United Arab Emirates. We went there with a lot of expectation and also to make progress in some key thematic areas it affect the Nigeria and other African nations. First of all, we look at our positions that covered areas like adaptation, loss and damage, mitigation, and global stocktake. So the Nigeria, under the auspices of the African negotiating team and G37, push our views and position in these areas. So the COP outcome at the national level, first of all, we are going to look at it. We'll have a post-COP activity to really extract its contents and know its implication to our national development, and also to ensure that some of the key outcomes are mainstream in our policy for national development. It will interest you to know that most of MDAs and private organizations participated in the just concluded COP, and we are going to bring them together to look at the outcome and as it affects each MDA, each organization, each institution, and also we think out a way forward on how to mainstream some of the key decisions in our national policies and implementation. The overall issue is there that we have to limit GHG emission to an acceptable range that will not be very, very disastrous to the to humanity and the entire earth. So Nigeria is going to work towards that. In the area of energy sector, we look at it and also come up with some strategic position and strategies in area of adaptation to make sure that we adapt to the adverse impact of climate change. Yeah, thank you, sir.
Thank you very much for that insights that you just provided on behalf of the Director General, Dr. Salisu Dahiru of National Council on Climate Change in Nigeria. We appreciate that intervention. Now, you just help us to appreciate that, as part of the global action, that Nigeria, of course, will continue to work on how it can support in bringing down the emission. You also spoke to the area of adaptation. And indeed, generally, you were looking at how we can make our policies more effective so that we can maximize the outcome of COP28. Thank you very much. We certainly appreciate the insights you provided. I would like to bring in our next panelist, who is, you can say that he's an expert in a whole range of areas, but interestingly, he's the Executive Director, Nigeria Center for Climate Renewal, Resilience, and Adaptation. He is very familiar with the terrain. And interestingly, he has provided advisory support, even for the financial sector. For instance, the back of industry, and then asset management cooperation. He was a co-founder of Climate Action and Community Outreach Initiative, an NGO that is focused on advocacy and introducing new climate-smart technologies to rural and urban areas. He is Mr. Abdullahi Ali Gendam, once again, who is the Executive Director, Nigerian Center for Climate Renewal, Resilience, and Adaptation. Mr. Gendam, perhaps you have insights you will want to provide on how we can maximize the outcome of COP28 in relation to loss and damage, and indeed how we can strengthen climate resilience in our continent. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you very much. Hope everyone can hear me.
We can hear you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Kit, for inviting us to this first webinar series of yours, 2024 terms outcomes of COP28 and benefits for African countries. I'm happy that you chose a topic that is also very, very dear to us at NICA, which is maximizing the outcomes of COP28 as loss and damage agreements, such as loss and damage agreements to strengthen climate resilience in Africa. So what I have here today is just a paper presentation, which I wrote just yesterday. I had to put it down so quickly because I felt this was a very important event. And I needed to give an overview of some of the activities that happened, some of the outcomes that happened at COP28, and how that affects and will benefit the African continent. But as an NGO and a civil society organization, I think it's always important for us to start by talking about nature. Nature is the planet's inbuilt mechanism for regulating climate and mitigating the impact of extreme climate events. So for nature to function optimally, it is essential that biodiversity encompasses all species interacting with each other and the environment remains intact and fully operational. To keep global warming to an absolute minimum, we must anchor and safeguard the natural systems that still exist, in addition to reducing greenhouse gas emissions as quickly as possible. These, in our view, are the most immediate and effective climate actions we have at our disposal. Africa has the world's lowest per capita greenhouse gas emission, but unfortunately, it's one of the hardest hit continents in terms of climate change impacts. Africa's poorest communities are often powerless in the face of extreme weather events, such as droughts and floods, while famine and the livelihood insecurity that ensue from these events are frequently and often very, very catastrophic. So the climate crisis is a global crisis. And what happens in Africa is obviously felt by the rest of the world. So it is therefore essential that the international community contributes to alleviating this pressure on the continent. And I must say, and kudos to the African group of negotiators who were very critical at COP in bringing to bear these issues in Dubai. I've just completed the COP in Dubai. Now, studies by the Addis Ababa-based African Center, African Climate Policy Center, ACPC, indicates that the increasing frequency and severity of climate change impacts disproportionately affects African economies and societies, with countries in Africa estimated to be losing an average of about 2 to 5% of their GDP, and countries diverting up to 9 to 12% of their budget into unplanned events. Let me give you some examples. In January and February 2022, Madagascar, Mozambique, Malawi suffered severe floods after a series of tropical storms hit the region, which affected more than 200,000 people, destroyed more than 20,000 houses, 300 schools, thereby affecting the provision of education to about 30,000 pupils. In Ethiopia, in 2020, Ethiopia experienced a severe flood from June through September. Local communities observed an increase in rainfall of between 150 to 400%, more than usual in mid-August and September. Almost 600 people to 1 million people were displaced, with damages estimated in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Unfortunately again for Ethiopia, this was then followed by a prolonged drought due to 4 consecutive failed rainy seasons since late 2020, which then continues to push an increasing number of people to the brink of famine. The drought that ensued negatively impacted the lives and livelihood of vulnerable communities in the southern and eastern part of the country, places like Oromia, Somalia, Afar, Sidama, and of course, the major part of the southern region of Somalia. By the end of September, 17 million people were affected by droughts throughout Ethiopia, thereby requiring multi sector life-saving assistance such as water, sanitation, shelter, and food distribution for the rest of the year. 3.5 million to 5 million livestock were estimated to have perished, and an additional 25 million were weakened and emaciated. These had a substantial impact on the direct health, psychological well-being, and economic stability of the affected community. According to Carbon Brief analysis of disaster records, extreme weather events in Africa have killed at least 20,000 people and affected a further 90 to 20 million people since the start of 2022. That's very, very alarming. However, the impacts of African extreme events such as heat stress often go unrecorded because there are no data. So even the figures even quoted here today could actually even be much, much higher. Now, at the just concluded 28th Conference of Parties in Dubai, numerous initiatives aimed at building Africa's climate resilience were announced, including the establishment of green banks, greenhouse gas trading systems, carbon tax and carbon trading systems that were discussed during COP. Financing measures such as green bonds and sustainability-linked instruments were also talked about and showcased, as well as a host of few funding pledges. Let me start with some of the pledges and announcements that were made under the public-private partnership platform. Number one, Africa and Middle Eastern leaders announced the launch of a $10 billion Global Green Growth Institute, known as GGI, which supports access for every safe initiative, a public-private partnership intended to transform food systems for millions facing food security due to climate change. Multilateral development banks, including the African Development Bank, Islamic Development Bank, International Fund for Agricultural Development, announced a joint investment of about $1.6 billion to assist the development of special agro-industrial processing zones with a focus on climate-resilient food systems as part of the SAFE initiative. Development of an electric corridor was also discussed to facilitate the transport of green electricity with a capacity of 3 gigawatts from Egypt to Italy. The corridor, obviously, is designed to use a high voltage direct current cable to transport renewable energy from Egypt to Italy, thereby creating a new energy hub, bridging the EU, the Middle East, and of course, Africa and the African continent. The battery energy storage system known as BESS Consortium was also formed, which aims to develop advanced energy storage solutions for African renewable energy. The consortium, obviously, is also supported by the African Development Bank. And I must say at this juncture, I must say kudos to AFDB. AFDB did extremely very well at COP28. The president of AFDB was all over the place trying to encourage African negotiators and also the various African countries that came to make their presentations during the COP. So the BESS consortium is supported by AFDB, the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, the Agency for Development, Africa 50 and Mazda, Burkina Faso, Egypt, Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, Malawi are some of the countries that have actually initiated in joining this consortium. I think the consortium is actually already operational, with Nigeria taking the lead role. In addition, attention to local climate action also took a very important stage, especially as the population of Africa's cities is expected to double by 2050, reaching about 1.5 billion people. So at COP, for the first time, COP28, cities which produce 70% of the world greenhouse gases were featured prominently in discussion. 12 African countries signed up for the Coalition for High Ambition Multi-Level Partnership for Climate Action that will enhance cooperation between national, regional, and local governments on planning, financing, and implementing national climate goals. This, I believe, is quite very important. Looking at the possibility, I mean, it's not even a possibility. Countries must review their NDC before 2025. So I think so it's a good thing that this is happening. Closely linked to the local action that was declared was also the Declaration on Climate and Health, which seeks better integration of health consideration into climate policies and processes. 30 African countries committed to the transformation of health system to be climate resilient, low carbon, sustainable, and equitable, and also to ensure preparation of vulnerable communities as it regards to the adverse impacts of climate change. Several initiatives were also announced by the African Development Bank. As I mentioned earlier, they did extremely well. So discussion on the establishment of green banks was championed by the AFDB, which could raise which is supposed to raise up to 1.5 billion in addition of green investment facilities in financial institutions in Benin, Cote d'Ivoire, Morocco, and Egypt, with the aim of enhancing the technical capacity of local banks to migrate risk and attract finance from investors. Now, one of the biggest problems African countries have faced is our inability to use our local financial institutions to access these foreign funds that are domiciled in the global north, or what we call annexed countries. Also, the launch of the African AFDB Climate Action Window was also done, which was aimed to mobilize about $4 billion for climate adaptation in 37 low-income countries across the continent by 2025. Presentation, this is very important, of an African climate risk insurance facility for adaptation known as ACRIFA, which aims to mobilize about $1 billion of concessionally financed high-risk capital and grants in support of the insurance industry in Africa. The facility, obviously, is to offer climate impact insurance to millions of farmers across the continent. A collaboration between AFDB and AFC was also initiated at COP28 to raise about $350 million long-term line of credit to finance infrastructure projects in Africa. The partnership, obviously, is to help reduce Africa's infrastructure gap, focusing on sectors such as power, transportation, telecommunication, and of course, natural resources. The African Development Bank also, in collaboration with other institutions like the African Development Bank, Germany, France, and countries like Germany, France, and Japan, also pledged $175 million to the Alliance for Green Infrastructure in Africa, which intends to attract private capital worth about $10 billion for green infrastructure. Now, there were also announcements made by countries. I think a few of them are important to mention here. The US, alongside the European Union, the UK, France, and Germany, also announced that the Just Energy Transition Partnership, of which South Africa is a member, will receive an additional $8.5 billion financing package for South Africa. The United States Agency, USAID, and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association announced that they were working with the World Meteorological Agency, the UN Office for Disaster Risk Management, and the National Meteorological and Hydrological Service to establish advanced early warning systems for floods, droughts, cyclones, and harvests in 20 African countries. As we all know, the problem is early warning systems, our ability to be able to predict events before it happens. I think if we're able to do that in Africa, that will go a long way in addressing some of these adversities that climate change. So that was a very good one that happened at COP. The US also made an additional $3 billion pledge to the second replenishment of the Green Climate Fund. And as you all know, a Nigerian is now heading that organization. Of course, the fund that was pledged was obviously subject to the availability of the funds. And they also mentioned that the country will champion an ambitious GCF regulation agenda that will include improved access to climate finance for African states and organizations. Also announced, this is also quite very important, was support for the Green Guarantee Company, GGC, the first privately run guarantee company devoted to green bonds and loans in developing countries, focusing especially on Africa, of course, other regions like Asia and Latin America. You say it also through the State Department and Prosper Africa and other organizations, alongside the UK Foreign Commonwealth Office, the GCF, and the Nigerian Sovereign Investment Authority, NSI, also announced a contribution of about $100 million to support the initial balance sheet of the Green Guarantee Company. The US also went further to announce an additional $1.4 billion in investment for the Women in Sustainable Economy, known as WISE initiative, of which Africa is also a beneficiary. The UK also announced a $44 billion investment to support clean energy transition and build climate resilience in Africa, with projects already underway, obviously in Sierra Leone and Kenya. The UK also pledged to the climate resilient debt clause to its new. The UK also pledged, yes, to the climate resilient debt clause to be included in its new and existing loan agreements with some few African countries such as Senegal and others. A large majority, as we all know, of the countries attending the summits also called for all creditors to be offered the CRDC, which is the Climate Resilient Debt Clause, in the agreement by 2025. This obviously will allow affected countries to temporarily pause debt repayments if they were to experience any adverse impact of climate change or climate disaster. This is also very important. I think most countries, for example, we remember what happened in Mozambique and Malawi. We'll talk about that later. So these are some of the pledges that were made by countries. I don't want to go too much into that. I think it's important I've run to some of the things that happened that most African countries also benefited from COP. Many African countries, as we all know, discussed a lot using climate diplomacy to also offer a platform for several bilateral and multilateral development agreements. For example, Nigeria signed an important energy deal with Germany to shore up its energy deficit. Rwanda also signed an innovative memorandum of understanding with Singapore to enhance its carbon market. Kenya signed a deal worth $4.48 billion to develop 7 important green projects in Kenya. Ethiopia announced a $600 million wind farm initiative with a developer from UAE. Nigeria, of course, also rolled out the announcement of its 100 fleet electric buses. Sierra Leone announced its first wind farm that will be backed by a renewable energy group from the UK. Angola announced a solar plant that will be developed to provide electricity for 90,000 homes with a backing from a company also from UAE. The Tunisia delegation also announced a goal to reduce greenhouse gas emission in the country by 45% by 2030. Very ambitious, as well as being one of the first countries, of course, to announce its intention to be carbon neutral by 2050. Uganda also received about $90 million from the Emerging Africa Infrastructure Fund for a 20 megawatt solar PV plant, while Zambia Copperbelt Energy Corporation announced it would issue Zambia's first green bond by the end of 2020.
Thank you very much. It's
conclusion, quickly. Africa, in conclusion, I think this is important. I will just skip to the last bit of this paper presentation. The continent needs to understand that the future of her people rests in the continent's ability to take advantage of our abundant green natural resources by adding value and being strategic through the development of an African template for the transfer of green technology, capacity building, entrepreneurship for a green and prosperous climate future. Africa cannot be a home to most of the green resources that is required to develop the electric industry in the global north or for the world. Presently, according to the president of AFDB, the electric car industry is worth $7 trillion. By the end of 2050, that industry will be worth about $57 trillion. And guess what? 30% of the green mineral resources that is required to develop the electric industry is going to come from where? Africa. So Africa needs to take advantage of our resources. Thank you very much.
Wow, that was an excellent intervention there from Mr. Alugenda. Thank you for taking us through all of those beautiful information, giving us the challenges that the African continent had faced and is still facing when it comes to the issues of resilience and adaptation are the mechanism or pledges that we saw at COP28. And indeed, what AFDD had done while we were there and is still doing to ensure that the African continent comes out in a manner that our capacity simply put enhanced. Often we're told that we have the least adaptive capacity, and now we're seeing the various pledges, commitments, pronouncements being made here and there. We hope all of that will come to fruition. Thank you very much. We will move on to our next speaker. We know we already have an agenda and we're going to tweak it a little bit. So you permit me to bring someone in who has a meeting, one of our distinguished panelists. He is a professional journalist with considerable experience and a keen interest in climate change and international development. Is the focal point for UNCC-led activities in Uganda. He is even responsible for supporting the implementation of Article 6 of the UNFCCC. Ladies and gentlemen, and indeed our distinguished audience, permit me to tell the Assistant Commissioner, Climate Change, Minister of Water and Environment, Uganda, to unmute himself and speak to us. He's Dr. Bob Natifo. Dr. Bob, my question to you will be, how can we build effective policies and strategies so as to maximize COP28 outcomes for us living here in this continent, Africa? What would you like to tell us, please? We're waiting to hear from you.
All right. Thanks very much, Eugene. Good afternoon, colleagues. Good morning from wherever you are. My name is Bob Natif. I work with the Ministry of Water and Environment, the National Focal Point for the UNFCCC. And I'm happy to be a part of this series of GET webinar. I heard earlier that this has been a series of engagements happening, but I think this is my very first time I'm engaging with the GETers in this webinar, and I hope we'll keep engaging on this subject matter as we go along. I am happy to be along with at least I know 2-3 colleagues that are also going to speak. So I'll be quite brief because I have another meeting starting at 3 p.m. and I'm the one who's chairing that, and I'll try to fix my thoughts into these 11 minutes that are remaining. But I'm happy to come back if the webinar is still ongoing, so I listen to the wrap-up of the discussion. So the question that you put to me, building effective strategies and policies to maximize COP or COP28 in particular, I was thinking about it and trying to see how best I can better position my thoughts, and my thoughts are bound around speaking to 3 or 4 key issues, because you can't build effective strategies and policies without making significant reference on where we are coming from in 1992. That's the Framework Convention itself. So I'll maybe take a minute on that. I know this is something that we all might be familiar with, but as I said, repetition is learning. I'll highlight a few things on that. Then I'll also come to the Kyoto Protocol as well, just in a minute, but also wrap that up with the 2015 Paris Agreement, and then now try to link it with just concluded COP28 in Dubai, where we've come up with the Dubai Declaration, and then once in a while put in a few things bound around what national policy and maybe the regional policies that we have. So as a first start, 1992, so countries come together to try to find a solution to this very big challenge that my previous speaker has talked about, how we are so much afflicted and what is it that we need to do as a globe. And so then we come up with the NFCCC, the convention itself as it's known. So with that convention, it frames very smartly the broader objective of what it is that we are looking for, just to make sure everybody else is on the same page, just to the main objective is bound around stabilization of greenhouse gas emissions that we are all trying to address in our respective countries. And later you'll hear how then that is being addressed within the Paris Agreement and NDCs. But also trying to do this within the parameters of thinking that as we do that, there are so many other things that need to happen. For example, you have to allow ecosystems to adapt naturally to climate change and to ensure food production continues unthreatened. But again, we all do that in essence, well aware that you have to allow economic development to proceed in a sustainable manner. Now, I could unpack what everything else says onto that, but maybe we'll organize another series of webinars so we get to the detail of that. But before we leave the convention, it's also important to look at what are the principles that guide this global framework that we came up with. And then you later ask ourselves whether this has really been followed or whether this has actually delivered the benefits that we so much looked out for. And the very first principle is that parties should protect the climate system for the benefit of the present and future generation of humankind on the basis of equity and in accordance with their common but differentiated responsibility. My previous speaker talked about just transition. So you can already see all these things are playing out way back in 1992. But then the question becomes, how is this being played out currently as it stands in 2024? So then that aside, then we come up with a Kyoto Protocol, which, as we know, was a legally binding document to compel most of the polluters, as we know them, to try and address their greenhouse gas emissions beyond certain levels in 1992. That was the very key objective. But there's also a second objective, which we often forget. The second objective is bound around ensuring that there's significant support to developing countries to ensure they are able to implement climate action and climate policy. I've done and I've written extensively about how these policies play about. And now the question that you can ask yourself, from 1992 to 2024, as an example, you can see even with these policies in place, emissions have been increasing. So the question that we should interrogate ourselves, and I'm raising this so that I build a bit of blocks into this broader topic that you've given me, the question that we should interrogate and ask ourselves, does really climate policy work at global level, and let alone climate policy working effectively at regional or even at national level? Because already the IPCC reports are telling us something significantly different from what we had ideally committed to achieve within the set policy. Come 2015, the world, as we all know, endorses a very ambitious agenda. The agenda to address climate change on one side, but also to address the runaway, the agenda to address climate change on one side, but also the idea to address sustainable development in an effective manner. And the heart of the Paris Agreement is very clear, limiting temperature rise to well below 2 degrees centigrade while maintaining 1.5 on the table, the concept of balancing emissions and sources to net zero, and this concept of saying, look, because we need to work within the carbon budget, make sure we limit temperature rise to well below 2 degrees centigrade, we must ensure that countries submit NDCs every after 5 years. And those NDCs is what we are talking about here as policies and strategies or carbon management plans that we've come up with to implement climate action. And every country has been at the forefront. And I think each one has put their best foot forward to see what it is they can do within their means. How far has that been achieved? I don't know, but we've just had the very first global stock take in Dubai, which ideally was supposed to be a negotiated outcome to say that, okay, look, how far have we gone with mitigation targets that we set? How far are we going with the just transition debate? How far are we going with adaptation, loss, and damage? And how far are we going with finance? So just to start with maybe loss and damage. Speaking from an LDC's perspective, the vulnerability that we experience actually puts a spotlight on loss and damage. Well aware that everything that we are trying to do now, or everything else that we've put our hands onto, or the climate impacts that we are faced with will never stop because of the so much damage that has happened over time. And that by extension, there's significant losses and damages that happen to individual people and then the different communities, and they're not able to bounce back. And there's a clear distinction between adaptation and loss and damage. The second key point, which in the global stocktake is bound around this just transition discussion, and the discussion that we're all familiar with right from the time it started in Glasgow in terms of either the phase down or phase out of coal. If you remember so well in Dubai, as it was different from Glasgow and Sharm el-Sheikh, we did have this discussion around fossil fuels going away from just coal as it were, but bringing all fossil fuels in the fold. Now, that has significant implications, not just in terms of just transition, but in terms of what countries need in order to keep afloat. Because if you read the relevant national policies, or if you read the relevant 40, 50-year long-term strategies, and you see where countries have vested interest in terms of unlocking their development pathways. For example, Uganda in its Vision 2040 highlights the need to focus not only on agriculture, but also to focus on minerals, ICT, and technology. And when you talk about minerals, we also talk about things to do with oil and gas, which you've just discovered. And when you bound things together as it is in Dubai in the name of phasing out or phase down of fossil fuels, it has very significant development implications on our part, because in the long run, that will mean we are hanging around stranded assets that we are unable to use to transform individual livelihood and well-being of the people. The issue of finance is a very sensitive issue, but also if you look at the NDCs that we've done and the corresponding implementation thereabout is bound around how to ensure, in order to ensure we implement all these carbon management plans that we've put forward, finance is at the heart and at the center of implementation of any climate policy that we've come up with. The question then becomes, where is this finance? But even in the discussions that we've had, I think you repeatedly could have heard about the new quantified goal, which from our case, we want it to be argued right different from how the Copenhagen $100 billion came about. It's much more clear, these years, because at least we've done NDC and the corresponding implementation plans where we kind of projected the amount of financing that is required, for example, for Uganda or South Africa or Kenya or Nigeria to implement its carbon management plans. So taking that as a collective, as a basis, maybe would be a good basis to kind of define this new collective quantified goal that we are looking at. But that's not the end of the story as is. My previous colleague has confidently and heavily talked about the pledges that came through. From where I stand, I think the pledges are a very good thing, but I think the other question, the question we need to interrogate is where these pledges end and how are we able to access whatever that is pledged, and how actually that the terms and conditions that are put forward for developing countries to access this financing do not end up tying a loose net around us in terms of implementing climate action. There is very good examples of action beginning on the ground. For example, he talked about the climate action window, which we're already beginning to take advantage of. But of course, when you look at the amounts of financing that are within such windows, which is a good window for adaptation, but I don't think it's going to provide all the answers that we are looking out for to implement both our adaptation and any other strategies that we are trying to look at, because the climate action window in itself is limited to 15 million US dollars per country, but that's the maximum end that one can access. But it also depends on how good your proposal is. Otherwise, it ranges from 5 and top end being 15. From experience, if you're going to implement just a single water project across the entire nation, so $15 million becomes a walk in the park. So how can we better utilize or better take advantage of all these pronouncements that have come out to ensure that we actually walk the talk in terms of implementation of the robust policy, implementation of the strategies, and implementation of the action plans that we've come up with? For me, that has been the biggest disconnect that there is. But hopefully, as we continue engaging and finding solutions where the money is, where and how easy we can access it, and how best can we write projects to access the financing, it is one of the key ways that we'll keep building on this. Final thought, it's not just about where the finance is, but I think it should also be looked at in terms of for us to go into the transformational edge that we're so much looking out for. Maybe we may have to begin looking beyond the grants that we receive, and then allow countries to access money, not so much with tight concessional terms, but so much in a way that it allows countries and parties to attract some kind of significant financing to implement the transformational agenda that we've set forth. So I'll stop at that and back to you. Thank you.
Excellent. Our distinguished Commissioner, Assistant Commissioner, Climate Change, Minister of Water and Environment, Uganda, Dr. Bob Natifu. Thank you very much for that very beautiful insight, helping us to understand a range of things around building effective policies and strategies. And one of the critical questions you had asked earlier is, does climate policy work at global level? That was one of the critical questions. And of course, you've gone ahead to give us further insights as to the global stocktake and what we need to do and how indeed even the financing, the pronouncement here and there, how we can assess the funding they are laced with. Thank you very much for that beautiful insight. I just hope you will not be late for your meeting, and kindly join us once you are done if we are still here. Thank you, Dr. Bob. And quickly, we will move to someone that will speak to us on how we can build strategic partnership. And just to say that she is an institute professional with hands on so many things, experience on multilateral trade and climate change negotiations, community engagement and advocacy. In fact, at present, she is the Chief Director, International Climate Change Relations and Reporting in the branch Climate Change and Air Quality Management of the Department of Forestry, Fisheries, and the Environment in South Africa. Permit me to tell Ms. Pemi Gasela to unmute herself and talk to us on the possibility of building strategic partnership for climate action, leveraging COP28 outcomes so that we can indeed foster regional collaboration. Madam Gasela, please talk to us.
Thank you very much, Program Director, and good afternoon, good morning, anywhere you might be listening from. As already said, my name is Pemi Gasela from South Africa, and I think in the interest of time, Program Director, I'll not go through, the COP28 UAE package, which has already been alluded to by the previous speakers. But firstly, to just take this opportunity to appreciate an invitation to speak in this webinar. And say, as already mentioned, COP28 concluded with a package called the UAE Consensus. Much of COP28 was about keeping the global goal to limit temperature rise to 1.5 degrees alive. And the only way to determine if the Dubai COP was able to keep the 1.5 degrees limit in reach depends on what happens next in terms of reducing emissions, adaptation to the impacts of climate change, recovering from damage, and mobilizing climate finance. Now, on leveraging on outcomes from international conferences, like the one we just had, COP28, can be a crucial strategy for fostering regional collaboration in Africa, especially in the context of climate change. For an example, if you look at adaptation, particularly with the global goal on adaptation, which is primarily a recognition in the Paris Agreement that adaptation is a global responsibility, and that countries and people which will be most affected by climate change contributed the least to its cause and are least able to adapt. With the adoption of the global goal on adaptation framework, which set targets to be achieved by 2030 for adaptation across themes such as food, water, ecosystem, and biodiversity, human settlements and infrastructure, health, and livelihood. This is an opportunity for Africa to work together in costing financial needs to protect vulnerable communities from climate impacts. Furthermore, the outcome set out to launch a 2-year work program to develop indicators that measure progress in achieving the GGA targets. African scientists could work together in ensuring that the International Panel on Climate Change, which is the IPCC report on adaptation indicators, and the matrix contribute to the second global stocktake and assist in measuring how Africa is building resilience and what are outstanding needs that will help Africa to reach the 2030 GGA targets. Now, on the operationalization of the loss and damage, which is something that has already been spoken about in details, Africa could form regional networks on how the loss and damage suffered could be addressed. Share best practices, innovative solutions, and successful case studies in climate action. Organize regional workshops and training programs to share knowledge and build the capacity of stakeholders within the region. On the global stocktake, the final text calls on countries to transition away from fossil fuel and triple renewable energy output and doubling energy efficiency by 2030. This is something that can assist in addressing energy security issues in Africa. African countries need to collectively collaborate in ensuring equitable clean energy access across the continent. On finance, there are still finance gaps to support the transition away from fossil fuel. Adopted finance decisions are still lacking timelines and fail to provide the support that most of the climate action needed to fully implement the GGA framework and keep within 1.5 goal through implementation of national just transition framework, as well as on the nationally determined contribution mitigation targets. New pledges were made to the Green Climate Fund, which seek to aid developing nations in their response to climate change. Pledges at the conference came at close to $12.8 billion US. The financial pledges are still short of the trillions needed to support developing countries, transition to clean energy, and implement their climate plans. Africa would need to work together to make sure that climate finance flow exceeds the previously agreed 100 billion per year, so that the average for the period between 2020 and 2025 is 100 billion. On transparency, parties adopted a decision which entails having several dialogues and sharing experiences on implementation of enhanced transparency framework, preparing submission by March of 2025 on challenges in developing the first biennial transparency report. The BTRs will be submitted by 31st December 2024 to track progress on implementation of NDC under the Paris Agreement. A synthesis report will be developed from the submission, which will assist in launching further work on addressing these challenges. African countries still need a lot of financial support to implement national systems for reporting under the Paris Agreement. This, again, is an area to leverage on collective support within Africa and sharing of best practices. On just transition, in South Africa, for example, much of the public debate is about our just energy transition. It's crucial for South Africa to address any negative impact the energy transition away from coal and towards more renewable energy will have on communities or workers. The GST underlines that just transition can support more robust, equitable mitigation outcome with tailored approach addressing different contexts. Just transitions are different in each country. In the adopted UAE Just Transition Work Program, there is a call for 2 dialogues to be held each year and create an important space in which countries can learn from each other, share lessons from their successes and failures, and seek international support as required. This, again, is another area of collaboration. On the unilateral measures on trade, such as the EU Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism that will impose a tariff on carbon-intensive imports, the whole of Africa objects to unilateral trade measures. Firstly, they are not in line with the equity and common but differentiated responsibility. Secondly, they mean that the developing countries will be de facto be funding the greening of European industry. Thirdly, they are against the rules of the WTO, the World Trade Organization, and trade liberalization because it impacts the competitiveness of products. This was also recognized in the 2023 Nairobi Declaration. As part of the COP agenda, developing countries need to establish a common understanding on unilateral measures. It needs to go beyond being an agenda with just proposed by the few. And this is also something that Africa as a region can have a coordinated approach to this plight so that this can go further in preventing unilateral measures, just as was done on the loss and damage that resulted in the adoption of the Loss and Damage Fund. And by strategically leveraging on COP28 outcomes, African nations can strengthen their collective efforts, share resources, and work collaboratively towards sustainable and resilient future in the face of climate change. I thank you.
Thank you very much. We appreciate those beautiful insights you just gave to us. Thank you. You've emphasized how regional collaboration can be formed and made to work. We appreciate that so much. We will just go to our. Meanwhile, before I bring in our final intervention by our distinguished panelists, I know some of us are already putting some questions in the chat box. Please, we encourage you to continue to do that, because with that, it becomes much easier for us to look at, and then we'll harvest. We will not have to waste too much time, because only the speakers have opportunity to speak. We do not, as participants, we don't have that opportunity. So we encourage you. Some of you are already doing that. If you have any comments, you have any observations, contributions, please kindly put them there in the chat box. We also want to see how we can leverage climate information. We all need this. Farmers, those in the health sectors, decision makers, all of us. For a whole society approach, we all need to be involved. We all need this information to help us understand better how this can be done. We have a very highly resourceful, dedicated, and goal-driven climate information service experts focusing on climate change adaptation. In fact, she's done something in the area of climate security. At present, she is actually at the Climate Prediction Application Center that is IGAD Climate Prediction and Application Center, with the support of the Norwegian capacity. She's doing all that she's doing. Permit me to bring to the closer to her own system, our Climate Information Service Expert of ICAP, or ICPAC, Nairobi, Kenya. She is Dr. Linda Ogalo. Dr. Linda, we all need information for climate action. So how can we leverage COP28's outcomes for our climate action. Please unmute yourself and speak.
Thank you very much, Dr. Eugene. I think it's always good to come as the last person because a lot of the explanation and the scene has been set. And a lot has already been said in terms of what the outcomes are for COP28. A lot has already been said on the region. And just to give an outlook of where I'm speaking from, for IGAD Climate Prediction and Application Center covers 11 countries in Eastern Africa. And we are a regional center for WMO. We are also a member of AUNEPAD, a water center of excellence. In addition to that, we have an observer status with UNFCCC, and we work with our member states. Bob Natif is one of us from Uganda. Uganda is one of our countries as well. We provide climate services to over 300 million people. And so the coverage is very, very large. So when I'm speaking, this is the context in which I speak of. And if my context does not cover the Western and Southern areas, the experts before have spoken about that. But this is generally the context in which I will cover Eastern Africa. And I think Mr. Abdullahi kind of talked about the issues that have been faced in the region, which we're talking about compounded risks that are happening every year. So in Eastern Africa, what seems to be happening is unprecedented is becoming the new normal. So we go from one of the strongest El Ninos in 2015, and then we had drought in 2016-17, and then we went into tropical cyclone in 2018-2019. So unprecedented rainfall again. From there, we went into extensive flooding that to the desert locust invasion in parts of the country that had not been seen in over 70 years. And we got out of that straight into a drought that lasted 2.5 years. That was again unprecedented in some parts of the region, had not been seen in historical record. And currently we're just coming out of a flooding event. So it's, when we're talking about climate information, and I think the limitations that we have with climate information is that the terminology, which has been the challenge with climate change when we define words, is that we use the same words, but we mean different things. So when we're talking about a drought in Africa, we're talking about the drought in Eastern Africa, we still use the same word drought, but we're talking about 2.5 years of failed rainfall. We've never seen that before, followed by a flood. But we're talking about unprecedented flooding. So there's no word that we have described yet to talk about communities who have to face risk after risk after risk after risk without any breathing space to recover. And a lot of the recovery for most of the communities need years. So when you have to face loss after loss after loss after loss, we end up finding that a lot of African countries end up spending most of them a lot of money that they would have spent on development. And I think that has been highlighted on addressing or responding to climate risks. So this is an example of a flooding that happened in northern Kenya in November. So this is basically what we're talking about, areas completely underwater. In the flooding from the October-December season alone, so far we have over 1.8 million people displaced. We have over 270 people dead, and the number affected are over 3 million. So we're talking about large numbers of people being impacted by climate extremes. And so when we look at climate information as a regional institution, we like to think about it from knowing what's going to happen in a few hours, to weeks, to months, to seasonal, to climate change, which means 30 years or more. So are we able to create scenarios to enable people to plan long term? And I think Bob asked a good question. What are we adapting to? Like, does the climate change policy work at a global level? And I think part of the challenge of the climate policy not working at a global level is sometimes the inability of us as climate scientists to articulate what this means. Because we talk about global warming, but like, for example, in Kenya, where our office is based, and I'm Kenyan, when you talk about climate change, everybody talks about planting trees, and this is everyone from the health sector to what people know about global warming and climate change is we need to plant trees from the African context, but we haven't really learned how to translate what does 1.5 degrees mean for agriculture? What does it mean for health? What does it mean for pandemics? What does it mean for the transport sector? And because we are always reacting to situations in terms of we're going from one extreme to another extreme, we haven't begun to even plan long term. What does this mean for agriculture, for policymakers 10 years from now? What does this mean for banana production, for example, for a country like Uganda that relies on banana? What does it mean for maize? What does it mean, the viability of different things? As we look at people changing how they eat, people encroaching into forest areas, what does this mean for pandemics, for example? So we haven't even begun in terms of understanding what climate information means in a specific way so that we can begin to respond to it. So what we're trying to do as a center is move from saying what the weather will do in terms of this is how much rainfall you'll get, this is what the temperature will be, to what the weather will be, to what the weather will do. So this is what we're calling impact-based focused. And there's a lot of challenges that we're facing with that because we don't, once again, as a continent, have a lot of data in terms of impacts historically. So it becomes extremely difficult to begin to understand when this happened, this is what happened, and then to be able to communicate this. And we don't, again, have a lot of research being done into long-term climate in terms of what the global warming will mean specifically for the things that make sense to us. Because again, as much as this information is given at a global level, at a regional level, the information is needed at a subnational level to the end users. So that information is still not being downscaled to the end users for them to be able to understand what to do with it. So those are some of the challenges in terms of the policymakers are not quite understanding what will the weather do. The farmers are not understanding in terms of planning long-term, what does this mean? So what we're trying to do as a center and what we need to do as a continent is get better at explaining what this means and moving from more, which is something that I think we always fail at when we come to a lot of these global conversations, is moving from emotional appeals to moving to fact-based, science-based policies. So having numbers is what changes things, because you can be a lot more emotional. As long as you can't prove it, then most times nobody's going to do anything. So I think Abdullahi talked about the importance of early warning. So and talked about the Early Warning for All initiative report that was one of the outcomes of COP. So what this report basically showed was the status of early warning. And if you looked at the report, it basically said the coverage in Africa is extremely low. So in order to be able to warn properly, you need to have the data and the observation networks globally, around Africa, to be able to get the predictions right. Because again, if you issue a warning and saying, for example, a drought is coming, a flood is coming, and then it does not materialize, then again, you begin to lose trust with the community. So there's still a gap in terms of trying to understand where the observation network is. There's a gap in terms of, I think, when we have global conversations, we have a lot of conversations about tech, we have a lot of conversations about moving to artificial intelligence, but in a lot of African communities, the infrastructure to implement a lot of these policies that are being suggested is still not there. When you talk to a lot of our communities and our farmers, they're still listening, even to indigenous focusters. They're not really understanding what the scientific or believing the scientists. So there's still a lot of work being done that needs to be done on the ground in terms of no-tech and low-tech. And this was acknowledged at COP as well. And because I think there needs to be a gap in terms of, bridge the gap between what the West is doing, but what the reality is on the ground, what we bring to the table, because a lot of the indigenous science or indigenous knowledge, again, is dying, but there's a lot that we can learn from in terms of to improve the scientific knowledge, to tailor make the focus, to earn the trust of the communities, to use these networks, again, to communicate climate information for early warning and early action. And again, the role of artificial intelligence for climate action, I think, and that was towards the technology transfer conversations, was also recognize. So even as we look at the challenges that we have with data, so what we're getting with AI becomes an opportunity for us to leapfrog in the way that Africa leapfrogged with a cell phone. AI is now creating us an opportunity for us to leapfrog and jump a few steps and to be able to improve our climate action in terms of data gaps, in terms of analysis gaps. And we are hoping the investment in research in Africa will be able to help us have a lot of climate action, be able to improve our impact-based focus. So when we talk about the continent and talked about climate security, and climate and security is particularly of interest to me, particularly because of the context in which I work. 5 of the 8 countries, IGAD countries, are either classified as conflict affected or conflict prone or fragile. And even the 3 countries that are not classified as fragile have areas, particularly around the borders, that are considered fragile. And you'll find that many of these countries that are experiencing conflict, which this is a continent, the colored parts of the continent, so you can see most of the continent is experiencing some kind of fragility or conflict affected areas. And what you find is when conflict is an issue, climate kind of takes a back space. And as much as we begin talking about access to climate finance, you find that there's almost no money going into fragile context because, again, of the context of fragility. So what we saw this time at COP that was actually pretty unprecedented was the declaration on climate and peace and security. So this was the first time I think we're having in the climate space this conversation of trying to look at what's going on with fragile contexts and the reality that most of these fragile countries in sub-Saharan Africa, in Africa generally, are the ones who are also largely impacted by climate impacts. And also the reality that as much as this context is, and for some of them, they've been in conflict for a long time. So as much as this is a reality and we're trying to talk about peace and security, we cannot leave the climate conversation behind for these areas. We cannot decide that they're too high risk to invest into. They also need to be prioritized in terms of access to climate finance. So that was a declaration that happened on December the 3rd, led by the UAE and was signed by most of the African countries. And it aligns with the WMO agenda for leaving no one for early warning for all by 2027, but also the 2030 agenda for sustainable development that promises to leave no one behind. And very often when we have a lot of this negotiation happening at a global level, because again of the context of conflict, most of these countries are not represented and therefore their interests are not represented. So for this time, for the first time in COP, we had a entire day centered on fragile and conflict affected areas and the benefit or the core benefits that can come from de-risking climate investments and what that would mean in terms of making them at the center of, one, ensuring that the investments that we're making for adaptation and mitigation is not increasing sensitivity and conflict among different actors, but also ensuring that these opportunities for green growth are also being used or being leveraged to bring peace among different communities. So the declaration basically called for investment in design, piloting, delivering, and scaling up of climate adaptation programming, which of course requires as well climate adaptation. So when I look at the gaps and challenges, and I think this is my last slide, in terms of where we still need to go, there's a lot of fragmented approaches when we talk about climate change, when we talk about climate change information, because it almost feels like everybody has a piece of the puzzle, but nobody's talking to one another. So when you talk about the energy space, everybody's focused on energy. And you come to health, you have the health people together, all talking about health. You have agriculture, the agriculture people get together, all talk about agriculture. But what we tend to overlook is that we're talking about the same people. It's the same people that's been impacted by all of this, but we still don't have a lot of ways in which we communicate together, work together, and figure out how we collectively have a one government approach towards understanding what the risks are across sectors, understanding how the different sectors can create co-benefits for one another. So we still have a lot of fragmented approaches in terms of understanding what the issues are, understanding what the impacts are. And particularly in Africa, there's still a lot of gaps in knowledge, which brings me to my second point, data limitations. So this is not just data in terms of observation, but data in terms of the impacts. And data, there's lots, and it's not necessarily that there's not no data. Sometimes you find that there's data, but it's in paper format. Sometimes you find it's data, but it's held by different organizations that are sponsoring different things. So you'll find the World Bank is sponsoring something, they'll do a study, whatever they have, the data will go back into their records. You have different people working, but nobody's collecting that data. So sometimes the data might be there, but it's not been collected. So it slows down our understanding and our science and contribution to the African perspective of the context of climate change and what it's doing and what it means in the continent. Again, we have limited communication and feedback mechanisms. What this means is that we've become very good, especially as a regional center of excellence of producing climate information at a regional level. But with our member states, depending on where they are, we still see a lot of gaps in terms of that then being downscale to a national level, and even at a region-wide, bringing it down to a sub-national level where lots of decisions are made becomes then a challenge. And then we also don't have a culture of that information flowing back up. I think we're very keen on having a top-down approach in terms of we tell you what's going to happen, but we are not keen on hearing, was the information useful? Were you able to understand it? Do you need it in a different format? And we don't, because again of limitations also sometimes in resources, in technical staff, we don't really have the capacity or the systems that allows for the users to then speak back to begin to tell us what else they need, or if the information we give was actually useful and given in a way that they understand. And then lastly, research in science for policy, which kind of answers the question that Bob was talking about in terms of does policy work at a global level. We are not very good at articulating, and I think when we talk about it we're very good at talking about things in general level, but we don't always, and this is not true for everything. You'll find there's a lot of research in agriculture because of the issues that we have had in food security. But if even you look at the IPCC authorship in Working Group 1, Working Group 2, Working Group 3, the representation from the continent is still extremely low because we're not supporting the research and publishing in high capacity journals in order to be able to tell our own story. So what we find is a narrative that has been told keeps on being told, and we're not seeing a lot of representation from the continent. So this is the largest gap that we need in order to improve how we understand climate information and specifically how we understand how it impacts us in the various sectors. Thank you.
Certainly, Linda, thank you very much for that eloquent presentation. You have even further created some level of awareness amongst us. And in terms of even understanding of the climate issues, you had talked about, or given an example of the terminologies used. I remember you mentioned the drought. It could mean different things to different people. And you talked about the information gap, even gaps in understanding, access to data, limited feedback mechanism, just name it. You reel out a number of things that we need to know. And like somebody just said, Samira, excellent lecture. Everyone here, our distinguished panelists, you'll be so excellent. Thank you very much. From our great audience, there are questions. I will try to highlight a number of them here. Please take notes. The one you'll be interested in answering, just take note of it. We have a gamut of them. And so let's look at why does Africa need funds and always begging for funding for implementation of policies? Why do we need funds? Why are we always begging to implement policies? Please take note of that. Another question is, how will African countries grow without focusing on industrialization and utilization of resources or have resources to grow the economy if the continent is subjected to drastically reducing climate change? Why others continue to grow using their resources? You have those two questions, and I do hope we're taking notes of what I'm reading out. Another question is, the AFDB is the fund holder of SEPA fund. That's the EIB. I'm trying to understand that question. Okay, the long and short of it is, why is this not being advertised? And why are many African small businesses not being educated to adopt the ESG and SDG framework? So I think he's trying to say for the SMEs to access funds, they need to put some mechanisms in place, building on SDG or ESG framework. The question is, why is the education of SMEs not taking place? I could also speak to that very briefly. Now, another person has said the webinar is good as a form of education and engagement. However, what will be done with the summary information and how will this be disseminated across the grassroots to avail ordinary lay people to gain from this weight of information to enhance engagement and influence change? So in other words, the outcome of this webinar, how do we cascade it to the audience that is not here and then to the communities as well? Maybe Dr. you can take that. Of course, Dr. Linda, I think this comes to you too. I have another one here. It said, this is a very educative webinar. How can we have this trickle down to local activities and those that plan to become climate change negotiators? Why is African governments? Okay, why is the African government do not care to finance or fund non-profits or private organization or company who are doing a lot to see that the environment is saved? Perhaps our honorable commissioner can take this. Dr. Bob, if you are still in the house, how can people in academia benefit from GET as a body and COP28 as an entity in terms of research, collaboration, training, grants, fellowship, etc.? How can climate data be utilized to design more inclusive and effective climate risk insurance products for communities and businesses? So developing products, insurance products that can assist in dealing with climate change risk. Another question is, I'm reading out all of the questions so that we'll take note of them. In the event that you do not remember anyone, please let me know, then I'll repeat it. Anyone you're interested in. What innovative approaches can be employed to ensure effective community engagement in climate education and awareness? And then the last one I have here is, how can biodiversity conservation strategies be informed by climate data, and what policies can support these initiatives? Our distinguished panelists, take as many as you would like to take, but very brief. We have about 15 minutes left for this session, and so let's utilize it reflecting on these questions. Thank you. Who would like to take the first shot?
Yeah, can I respond, sir?
Yeah, please go
I'm
ahead.
hearing you. Yeah,
Please
thank
go
you.
ahead.
The presentation has been very, very interesting, and a lot of key issues have been raised. Why do we need fund to always request for fund for climate climate action implementation? This is key because if you take it from the historical perspective, we recall that we are not really, our GHG emission is very low. And in the spirit of multilateralism, there is need for the developed country that have more of the resources to really assist the developing countries to address the concern raised by climate change. We are not only requesting for fund or finance. What we are talking about is means of implementation. That means we need the technology, we need the finance, we also need the capacity building to really drive this process. The developed countries are well ahead of us in this area. So there is need for partnership and collaboration and sharing of resources to make sure the objective of the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement is really achieved. Also, we have our natural resources. We are not at present, I don't think there is a rule of using our natural resources to really develop, but we should use it efficiently. Like now, countries are talking about net zero emission. Let our emission be reduced while we are still growing. Let our emissions be reduced while we are still removing ourselves from working against poverty increment in our societies. So we should be using our resources efficiently and in a low carbon pathway. That's my submission in these two questions that was raised. Thank you, sir.
We appreciate you, Dr. Chooks. We appreciate your intervention. Linda, would you like to say something? In brief,
Sure,
please, very brief.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of challenges in terms of why this information does not trickle down to the subnational and national level. And also, I think someone asked about why they're not being trained as African negotiators. This COP negotiations are government negotiations and not negotiations by NGOs. There's a lot that happens on the side, but it's a government that actually negotiates for itself, because whatever position that every country gives is a position by the government. So then not everyone can go in and participate and just say whatever they want. It has to be within the national priorities. And I think Bob alluded to that earlier in terms of being able to, as Africans, try to see what are we committing to in terms of the need for development versus the need for meeting the 1.5 degree goal. So it's a hard thing for policymakers to do, because one, we're not very good as climate scientists in terms of explaining what the issues are, but also we are not, I think you touched on the issue of finances, us not being the people who cause the solution, so why should we be the ones to pay? But also realizing a lot of the policymakers get elected on a 4 or 5 year cycle, and we're telling them about 2030, 2050, 10, 20, 50 years. It's very easy, because you want to get re-elected, for you to put up a road than to start working on something that nobody will see the result that you cannot use for re-election. So it's also up to us to educate the common people so that this becomes the expectation of they have of their leaders, such that their leaders will begin to deliver. So there's been a rise for us to talk to the policymakers, but the biggest gap is, are we making the African people understand and ask more of the leaders, because as long as it's not what the people demand, then the leaders are going to do what the people demand, which will get them reelected. And that's not the climate change agenda, unfortunately.
Yeah, thank you very much, Linda, for that intervention. Very well appreciated. Please, there are other distinguished panelists. I don't know if there are things you also want to say, but just to quickly say that if you need more information on GET, just check the box here. There are things already highlighted that you can pick from. That GET is been doing. You can take more information from there. Just to also say that Natural Eco Capital, the organization I represent, doing this in collaboration, had actually developed what we call the Climate 22 kits for AFDB, for the SMEs, for the African continent. So that is also, and a whole a number of SMEs were trained so that they will be in position to utilize this very instrument. So you can access that and then do that. We are also at the forefront of supporting in the development and in building the capacity of SME, even like you had actually asked regarding ESG. And yours sincerely, I am one of the certified trainers for SDG, UNDP SDG Impact Standard. You can check it, just search, go, and then you find more information on SDG Impact Standard. I'm one of the certified trainers for that program. So for the SMEs, yes, and that's SDG Impact Standard. Any organization, no matter how small you are, you can utilize this standard to integrate and indeed strengthen your sustainability. It will support you in your decision making. Now, other distinguished panelists, please, is there any other person that would like to speak? The floor is open. We have about 7 minutes left. Yeah, please go ahead.
Yes, can I quickly go through the one on innovative approaches for effective community engagement?
Yeah, please go ahead.
I think one of the things that can be done is to organize regional workshop and training programs to share knowledge and build the capacity of stakeholders. That's one of the ways that can be employed. Foster partnership with grassroots organization, educational institution, and youth-led initiatives to enhance the impact of climate change project at community level. And I think one of the things that that now we have a lot that has happened on the media. I think collaborate with the media, civil society organization, influencers to raise public awareness about the importance of regional collaboration and addressing climate change issues. I think this is one of the things that can be employed to ensure effective community engagement. Thank you.
We certainly appreciate that, Madam Gasela. Thank you very much. Well, I don't know if Dr. Bob is back. In case you are back, you want to speak, and then Mr. Agenda, are you there? Would you like to say anything as part of your closing remarks? Okay. Well, I think just to say that the session has been quite exciting, a whole lot that I think personally I've benefited from and that I've learned from. I can see some persons talking about how they want to have their capacity built. And interestingly, this program and indeed the webinar series by GETS, for which we now collaborate, been there at the forefront, looking at a whole range of issues, talking about the issues of the day. Are we looking at diseases? Are we looking at climate issues? Sustainability generally. They are all there. And the forthcoming webinars will build on all of these issues and deepen the conversation. We want to thank all of you for being part of this. For me, it was quite exciting. For our distinguished panelists, we want to certainly appreciate you making yourselves available, and giving us those beautiful insights we just got from you. Is it possible for the person that has our host, can you just mute whoever is speaking, please? So we want to thank all of you, and the management of GET, management of Natural Capital. We want to thank all of you. And indeed, like Dr. Dotuha said earlier, were you not to be here, our distinguished audience, it would have just been a conversation amongst the panelists, but it wasn't so. You loaded the Q&A with your observations, with your comments, with your questions, which added color to the overall conversation. We want to thank you for that. And indeed, our next events will be announced soon. We will let you know, and we look forward to you joining. But take note, the next edition will be in February. And hopefully, you'll be able to join that session. It's an exciting session, so we look forward to it. Dr. Dotun, do we have the privilege of having a group photograph with everyone? Can that be done? Otherwise, we close the curtain.
Okay, can we, I think we should be able to do that. Faith, can we do that as fast as possible? But we have to put on our cameras and let our beautiful faces, people see our beautiful faces. Dr. Eugene, your camera is not on.
I don't know what you highlighted it, so I don't know what you have done to my own camera. It was on earlier. I don't know what had happened.
It's your
So
camera.
You cannot see me, isn't it?
No, we can't. Oh,
so what is the
suggested would Faith, is there anything you can do to that?
I think it's the host that stopped my camera from showing. So can you see me now?
You now. Yes, we can. So Faith, can we take it?
Yeah. Okay. I can't see myself here.
Fantastic. We can see you, don't worry.
Interesting. I cannot see myself, so I don't know.
So on behalf of Global Emerging Pathogens Treatment Consortium, we want to say thank you to you, Dr. Echin, for the way you've handled the webinar today, and also the options you've given. I used to tell people collaboration is the biggest form of innovation. And one of the reasons why we organize this webinar every month is to create platforms for African experts and organizations to get to know each other, to get to know what different people are doing in different parts of the continent, and get to see platforms for collaboration. Because I believe one of the biggest challenges we have in Africa is organizations and countries working in silo, and there's only little you can do alone as an individual or as an organization. So this is another webinar, and we'll sincerely hope that some of our participants and our speakers will have met one or two persons that are doing something similar, that they can get to continue discussion with even after this webinar. Thank you very much to the participants, to the moderator, and to our speaker. By God's grace, we are going to meet again this time next month to discuss something else that is very important to the continent And the webinar, the recording of the webinar will be shared on the GET YouTube. The presentations will be on all our social media platforms. And if you need any information about the webinar or about GET, you can get to know us more on our website, on our social media platform. Or send an email to me. My email is bobadoye@getafrican.org. Until we meet this time next month, have a blessed day and bye-bye from GET.
Bye, everyone. Thank you very much.
Yeah, bye everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.